Hi guys, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be doing something a bit different. I'm going to attempt to paint a green scenery fully with gouache for the first time. So this isn't going to be a tutorial, but I'm just going to basically talk about how I approach learning a new medium, since I haven't taken up another medium probably since high school while I paint my first ever gouache painting. I've always wanted to try painting using gouache, but since I make watercolor videos on YouTube and Skillshare, and the medium is just easily available to me since it's always in front of me, I kind of put the idea aside. Even though I've already bought a set of gouache paints from last year, I've actually painted with gouache back in uni, where we had to make a self-portrait using gouache by separating our self-portraits into something like 4 values, and we had to basically flatten the painting and make it look sort of like vectorized. Then we were told to use gouache to color them as flat areas, which is why I don't really consider that as a real painting with gouache, since I felt like it was just like coloring it in. So we didn't really get to explore with the medium. Or, as you probably know, I also love my white gouache and my watercolor paintings, but this is going to be the first time where I'm going to attempt painting something properly and completely with gouache. The reason I've been keen on trying the medium is because of its similarities with watercolors, and yet it's opaque and can be also thickly applied like acrylics, which is a medium that I'm also used to working with, especially back in high school. So in my head, it's like combining the two mediums, and I find that really interesting. So with that in mind, I decided to do some digging and look for online classes or tutorials on painting with gouache. And I found a class on Skillshare by Ayna Paisley. The video isn't sponsored or anything, I just wanted to mention her because I genuinely enjoyed the class. The class is on how to paint greeneries with gouache, and since I like the subject and on top of that I love the style of her painting, which is more of an impressionist style with soft colors and the strokes are loose and expressive, which is what I'm going for, I think that it was the perfect class for me, as it has all the things that I was interested in learning. She treated the painting more like an acrylic painting, where she used the gouache in a thicker consistency, which is what I'm not used to. I was actually thinking of using it a bit more similarly to watercolors and maybe adding thicker consistencies towards the end as details, but this was such an interesting method for me, and it really got me to get out of my comfort zone, especially with the style of loose painting, and really transforming the painting from the reference into something else that is more dreamy because of the impressionist style. And I think that it really helps me to loosen up my paintings, since I'm so used to painting something that is a bit more controlled, especially with my watercolors. Her class was formatted like a paint with me, but I didn't have my supplies ready, so I just first watched it and tried to soak up as much of the information, and then I applied it to my own painting instead of following the reference that she gave out. There's really nothing wrong in painting along to her actual painting, as I know a lot of you guys also paint along with my painting tutorials. I know that it's a form of learning that everyone likes to do, and I also think that is quite helpful actually. In fact, that's one of the methods we also learned with back in high school. There were several methods in regards to learning, but when it comes to style, one is to paint or redraw from certain artists, and another approach is to analyze the techniques by looking at textures, colors, and things like that, and then applying the techniques to a similar subject matter. So, with learning something new, I think you can pretty much go both ways, but choose whatever method you're comfortable with. The class itself was also formatted as a paint with me, so I think that was also her intention for students to paint the same thing. But personally, my favorite way of learning is to learn the technique instead of the painting and to see if I'd be able to apply the techniques I watched or learned into my own painting. But again, there's nothing wrong with using a reference. Sometimes I also like to copy from a reference, especially when I want to learn the accuracy of a certain subject. But for a more stylized, loose approach, I usually like tackling the art in this method. I personally like this method of learning because I feel like it's more flexible for me to put in my own style within the painting, even though I'm using new techniques that I've just learned. But I understand that if you're completely new to painting, maybe this isn't the best method if you haven't gotten a good grasp of the fundamentals yet, like drawing and visualizing a painting. I think that someone asked me before in the comment section if they would need to learn to draw if they want to learn to paint. And I would have to say it depends on how you want to approach it. If you want to paint as a hobby and for fun without worrying about the overall result that much, then I would say probably no. But if you want to take it a bit more seriously, I think that drawing is basically a fundamental that'll help you visualize what you're painting because you are still trying to transform a two-dimensional surface to create three-dimensional objects or subjects. And the fundamentals like color theory, form, perspective, and things like that will always apply no matter what medium you use. I think I've probably mentioned this before in one of my older videos, if I'm not mistaken, but I always think that all of the fundamentals learned from drawing is basically like learning music theory and basics such as rhythm, tempo, reading the notes, or musical phrasing, which is applicable to whatever instrument you play because they're more of a concept of how the music works in your head. And once you have a good grasp on the basics, it's easier for you to learn other instruments because you only need to learn from the technical aspect of it, and the rest that you learned before, which is the theory and things like that, are applicable to any instrument that you play. And that's basically the same as learning to draw before painting or learning to draw and paint at the same time. So when you do try other mediums, it's a bit easier to learn just the technicality of the medium, and you would get to explore more without being burdened by other stresses from shapes or color mixing and things like that. I'm not saying I have the fundamentals down. In fact, I'm so far from it. I think that the fundamentals are quite important though when you're learning to draw or paint, and it's something that you can always improve on and learn as you analyze your surroundings. But grasping some of those basics really helps me to learn other mediums because, like I mentioned before, I don't have to multitask as much because I do have other basics that I can lean on. Even if you do want to create something more stylized, the fundamentals will help you get the essence and help discipline yourself in pointing out the important features that you want to stand out in your paintings. So, in my opinion, it's important to learn the fundamentals, and drawing is one of the basics before you learn to paint, which is why I try to always include a little bit of drawing and form before painting in my tutorials. But is it necessary? I don't think so. If you're treating painting as more of a hobby and relaxation, it should be fine. Whatever you do, you can just attempt to paint straight away, as art should serve whatever need you specifically have in your life instead of it being this unattainable thing that is too intimidating to attempt. So just go by your level and see what you're comfortable with. Mind you, saying all of this, it doesn't mean that I was also fully comfortable either when I was painting this, because I haven't painted with acrylics or thick paint for a while, and I wasn't used to the thick consistency of gouache since I'm so used to watercolor being able to glide easily on paper. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm learning something new, I tend to work too quickly because I don't necessarily understand which parts I should be more careful with. And in a way, I was scared of making something ridiculous that I wanted to get it over and done with. One thing that I realize is that I always get intimidated at the start, and on top of that, the first layer of painting honestly never looks the best, and that usually lowers my confidence to keep going. But in actuality, the first layer always looks a bit weird or awkward, as you're just basically mapping out your painting. So once I keep telling myself that, I decide to keep going, and the painting starts to develop and take shape as I paint more on top of it, which also builds up my confidence. The first time may feel awkward and uncomfortable, but if you slowly build it up and once you finish, you'll feel a sense of accomplishment that will help you want to paint further. I also see this happening with the children that I teach when I made them hold a brush for the first time, and it's quite amusing to watch because I can totally relate to the discomfort. And if you were the same, I think the key is just to keep going and don't give up. And even if it's hard because we tend to be a bit more impulsive at the beginning, try to take your time to think before applying the paint and try to enjoy the process and follow the flow of learning something new. Another important thing that I forgot to mention is that I always try to understand the special characteristics of the medium as well. These are basically the technicalities, like what I mentioned before with musical instruments. I try to understand the difference between the medium or mediums that I'm used to painting with in comparison to the one that I'm starting to learn. That way, even if at the start I forget about these characteristics and maybe make mistakes, I'm always keeping a mental note whenever I make those mistakes and why, and that way I can start to familiarize myself with the new medium. So some of the things that I like to keep in mind is things like how fast the medium dries if it reactivates with water, how wet paint on paper reacts with new application, and if the paint changes values as it dries. So as an example, watercolor always dries much lighter compared to when it's wet. However, gouache is the complete opposite. Sometimes it also helps to search about these characteristics as well, which can help me be more aware of what's going on as I apply the paint. However, I wouldn't do too much though, because I think that too much information can also turn a medium to be something more intimidating than it should be. I just try to keep in mind that making mistakes are part of the learning curve as well. And for me, I'm so used to watercolor and how it glides so easily that when I try to paint thickly with gouache, I do things like I forget to add water sometimes because I keep telling myself that I want a dry brush texture, that I went a bit too overboard with a thick paint. So it does take some practice to get used to using a medium as well as finding the balance that you need to finish a painting. And it does help if you can sort of troubleshoot the problem. So if parts of the painting look a bit too thick for me, I know that gouache is water soluble even if it's on paper, so I can lighten it that way. Take note though that if you're using acrylic gouache, it does not reactivate, so it dries completely still. So there's a slight difference between the types of paint you use as well, and it's always better to be aware of those things. At the end of the painting, I'm glad I kept going even if I was uncertain about painting certain steps, but once I was able to get to the final layers and add the finishing touches like tiny details and introducing elements like flowers, which is basically like decorating your painting, I felt so much more comfortable and the process becomes more enjoyable for me. After this, I do plan on painting more with gouache with this style and technique, but I also want to maybe try this with food illustration where I use it more like watercolors as the base color and then applying thicker consistencies for detail. I actually think that it would be less planning involved as well because we can always layer on a new color when we make mistakes aren't like watercolors, but I'll just have to experiment and see. So that's basically the completed painting. This is my first gouache painting, and even though this isn't a tutorial, I hope the points that I mentioned could help you in some way if you're trying to pick up a new medium. As usual, all of the links to my social media as well as the tools I used for this painting will be in the description box. And if you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!